They restrict themselves to describing objective reality because scientific dogma states that there is nothing else real to describe. So that's where they quit. Cultural beliefs and career fear suppress a larger view. Academia is not so open-minded as it claims. So you probably won't find going much further in academia than just now beginning to believe that our reality is indeed virtual. And this is not just philosophy, this is science. In other words, Fredkin did experiments. Fredkin had science that made him make these statements. He didn't just make them because it came to him in a dream or something. He presented his facts in a physics forum and said, this has to be that way. Much as the Bohr and Heisenberg did when they first looked at the double slit experiment. Okay, so let's talk about virtual realities a little bit. Virtual reality, each individual participating gets their own personal data stream. Remember we said earlier when we had those pictures of the two consciousnesses communicating with each other, that's one of the facts of consciousness and of digital reality is that everybody has their own reality. Now if you look at this chart, you see I have some yellow words and I have some orange words. The orange words reflect the consciousness view and the yellow words reflect the computer games view. So in the computer games, the characters in the game setting in the computer games, that's your character and your character's objective reality that's displayed on your local computer. Okay, that corresponds to you, the body, and your environment in this reality. Okay, so you have the server in the computer game, and that analog is the larger consciousness system in this virtual reality. Okay, the local computer stores characters' contents and experience, and what we call the free will awareness unit is part of your conscious, that part of your big C consciousness that's here. That's what you associate with brain function in this reality frame. Okay, the players that provide intent and free will in the computer game, those players are in the consciousness game in this physical reality, or your free will awareness unit, the individuated local PMR consciousness. Okay. The computer games we play are a very simplistic version of the reality we live in. That's because our reality has evolved and theirs was programmed. The evolution in this big simulation is much more detailed, much more precise, and much more varied than the programming of a World of Warcraft. Okay, so that's the comparison. Now I'm going to talk about databases, past, present, and future. And this is a seminal idea. This is a basic concept you'll need in order to understand a lot of other things. Okay, when you have a simulation, you have an outer loop that's called the time loop, and that's the one that increments the delta t. We talked about that before. So time moves forward every time the simulation adds another increment to time. All right, now, in order to create this virtual reality, the process that's done is that all of the action here in this virtual reality happens in the present. All of your choices, your free will, only acts in the present. Okay, there's no free will. You don't exercise free will in the past. You don't exercise free will in the future. You only exercise free will now, at the present moment, and at the next present moment. Okay, but the system needs to know what these present moments are. Remember, this is a virtual reality, so it has to be computed. So the system wants to know what's likely to happen next. That's important so we can get ready for what happens next. So, if you have this big multiplayer game, you need to have a little lead time for your computations. So it does a probable future. It guesses. It says, well, given everything I know, which is a lot, okay, that's all the characters, you're the characters playing in the game, What do I know? I know everything these characters have ever done in the past. I know every thought they've had, every emotion they've had, every feeling. I know all this about them. I know where the wind is going to blow next. I know if this rock is going to roll down the hill because I can look at the probability of all those things happening. So what is the future going to be like the next delta t? Well, it's only 10 to the minus 44 seconds from now, so it's not such a big guess to guess what's going to happen in that little bit of space. And then it says, well, now, given that I was right with that guess, given that I was right, that assumption, what's probably going to happen in the next delta t? And given that I'm right in that process, what's likely to happen in the next delta t? And the system can work out what then I call the probable future database. And it can increment that out as many delta t as it wants to. Of course, it's got this assumption that the last one was right when it predicts the next one. So it gets rattier and rattier the further out in time you go, the more it is that it's guessing, and the less real probable, the lower the probabilities get. So that's called the probable future database. That's a database that exists within the larger consciousness system, and it's one that we can access. Okay? That's where your precognitive dreams come from. You're getting data from this future probable database. Okay, now, we act then in the present. The next delta t comes, and here we are, we're in this game, we do something. We make a choice. And that choice then is made with our free will in the present, and then that data is saved, and the saved data becomes our past. So you see you have this future probability, and that future probability is the probability of every possibility. Okay, so it's every possibility, everything that could happen, and the probability that it does happen. That's the future probable database. Then, in the present, it happens. Then you have a record of what we did, all the choices we made. Call that our history thread. That's all the things we did. But then there's all the things that we could have done but didn't. And I call that the unactualized history. But the history database is really just all one big history database, and it's really just a reflection of that future probable database. Everything that we could have done and the probability that we would do it, we do something, and then all that same information becomes all the things that we could have done and the probability that we would have done them. Plus, here's this one little history thread that is what we actually did do of all those possibilities. So those are the databases, and these databases then are key in understanding a lot of paranormal events and how the world works. Okay, so those are fundamental databases. All databases are populated by you. Okay, there's your potential future database. What are the things you're likely to do in the future and the probability of that likelihood, and you in the past. Okay, so you are there in the future and the past, but you're there as a probabilistic model. You, the individuated unit of consciousness in your entirety, but without free will. Okay, now what's the difference between you with and without free will? Free will only exists in the you in the present. That's where the choices are made. That's what you need free will for. In the database, as a probable future, there's a model of you, the probable model of you. In the past, there is a model of you, and that's the past, all the past possibilities. So you see, you are a collection of rules, you're a collection of history, you're a collection of everything that makes you up. Your attitudes, your wishes, your dreams, all your emotions, all of that is part of the record. Everything that's you. The only thing that isn't there is a free will that makes choices. But other than that, it's you completely. All your history, all your thoughts. And that's what that model of you is in the past, and that model of you is projected into the future. Okay, now that's maybe a little hard to get just yet, but we'll go by it again a few times. Okay, so what you are in the larger consciousness system is information, data, a probabilistic model of your history and your potential to experience you need to be constrained within a virtual reality to give your experience context. Okay, so within that virtual reality, you are a conscious, independent, separate entity with free will. That's the way you see yourself. That's where your individuality comes from. Your separateness is because you're put into a virtual reality. Okay. You are a reality frame specific fractal representation of the larger consciousness system and thus have free will to make choices within the present moment. Now, the actualized and unactualized past databases, like I say, are really all the same database. It's just a history database with our thread, a line of all the states in that history that makes up what we actually did. All right, now here this is in cartoon form, perhaps, yes. That'll make it a little easier to see. Here's time at the origin, time's going out on a radius in all these directions. There's time going out. And this is the probable future. Now, the further away, the present moment's at the center. Time equals 0. This is time in the future. So time equals 0 is the present moment. And these are all probabilities. Probabilities going up, normal to this disk. So you notice that you have a lot of tall peaks as you get toward the origin. That's because we're getting closer and closer to the present moment. So it gets easier and easier to predict what's likely to happen, given all the data that you have. Out here around the edges, it's a little more sparse, but sometimes you get some high peaks, like here, and sometimes out here you get some high peaks, and those are things that are a good bet. If you were a prognosticator, you'd maybe want to put your money on those things happening because they look like they're pretty high probability of happening. But those probabilities can change. It's just probability. So just think of the surface as disappearing down the hole in the center. The center is the present. And when it disappears, that surface just kind of goes into the hole, and as it does, all those probabilities come and go. And when it disappears through the hole, it comes out the other side, and it's the past. Probability of everything that could have happened, what did, and what didn't. So sometimes you'll find that there are, here's a probability that's stretched. So it's this is some sort of probability of an event happening, but it could have happened earlier, it could happen later. It's unclear in the time. And here's something that all of these occur about the same time, but they're different events that are related. So this is just a cartoon to let you get the idea of this surface flowing into the hole and disappearing. All right. Now let's just go on. Okay. The setting is rendered as required, uniquely to each player. We've said that a couple of times. This is what happens in virtual reality game. You'll notice in virtual reality game, if you play World of Warcraft, I'm familiar with these games because I've had kids that played these games. I'm too old to have played these games very much. But when my kids were middle school and up, they spent a lot of hours playing these games. My sons both like World of Warcraft. My daughters both like The Sims. That's why I say them both girl games and boy games, right? Making house and making violence. So, anyway, in a World of Warcraft, I noticed that when a character would suddenly change direction, if you suddenly rounded a corner or suddenly turned around, you could see the mountains and the trees and everything in the background suddenly just kind of shooting up out of the ground. It would take just a fraction of a second before they were actually put on your screen, so you could see them appear out of nowhere. Well, that happens here too, except our computer's much faster. Our time increment's 10 to the minus 44 seconds or thereabouts, so we don't notice that, but it works the same way. There was no reason in the World of Warcraft for the computer to generate that background if there was nobody looking at that background. That would just be wasted resources. You have the sense that that's always there because you believe you live in an objective reality, but it's not always there. So we all get our own data stream. It's just data as consciousness. We interpret this data as being this physical reality, just like you interpret the data on your screen in a computer game as being that physical reality. Okay. Okay, now a unique data stream to each player doesn't mean that things disappear from the virtual reality if you're not looking at them. They were never there in the first place. See, it's an objective reality that makes you think those things are real and they have to be there all the time. They're never there in the first place. That's just habitual thinking. They just disappear for you from your data stream. That's all. They disappear from your data stream. So historical consistency in the rule set keep the reality approximately objective wherever uncertainty is small. Okay, for an example, let's say that there's a small town and there's a park in the center of that small town and has a great big tree in it. Okay, now if you think that, well, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and everybody's asleep and nobody's looking at the tree, does the tree disappear? Of course not. The tree was never there anyway. The tree was just data in the minds of the people, you see. There wasn't actually a tree there. The reason you get confused with those kinds of questions is that you believe in an objective reality. The tree really wasn't there. The tree's just in the consciousness of the people observing. So when somebody wakes up or drives through town and they look over there, what are they going to see? They're going to see a big tree, because consistency of the reality, the rule set says that the tree will be there. So everyone that looks there gets the data for the tree downloaded into their consciousness. They see the tree. So there really is no tree. So you set up a camera outside, say, I'm going to set up a camera and see if this tree disappears. You set up your camera, and of course the camera all night long sees the tree. Why? Because the camera's taking data, right? It's not a person. It doesn't have to be a person. Remember, it's not that consciousness makes the probability wave collapse to a particle. It's that data, information here does. So that camera's taking information, so it sees a tree, because that's what the rule set says is there. That's what evolved to be there. That's the set, if you will, of the game. So the bottom line here is that every detail of everything in a virtual reality does not have to be rendered all the time. Now that saves a whole lot of computer resources, doesn't it? You only have to have a data link going out to each of the players. One might ask, but doesn't something have to calculate everything anyway, just in case someone makes a measurement? In other words, if someone looks, requires the information? No, it doesn't. The virtual reality works from a probabilistic model, not a deterministic model. The larger conscious system can use the lowest fidelity statistical model it can get away with. Besides, it knows what data is probably going to be needed and has plenty of time to compute that data before it's needed. That's why it has the probable future database. And it's working on a time scale that's much smaller than 10 to the minus 44. It has lots of cycles in its clock, and that non-physical reality clock, for every one cycle on our clock. Okay. So if you believe that the universe is in a specific state at this instant, that's a scientific belief. When the astrophysicist looks out at the universe with his instruments, his telescopes, okay, the future probable universe may be in any one of 1,000,000 states, many of which may be nearly equal probability, some quite different than the others. When he makes the measurement, he gets one of them. Remember I told you I was going to tell that you're going to make a measurement? It's like you go in and you randomly draw something out of that box, okay, of possibilities. When he makes a measurement, he gets one of them. And after that, that's the way our universe is at that particular place, okay, in space. And it has to stay that way, just like the electron or the photon had to stay that way as a particle once it got measured, once its data became part of this reality frame. Okay. So the universe's probability function, at least the probability function for the part that astrophysicist was measuring, collapses to a given physical state. So you now see what happens to that photon in the double slit experiment is exactly what's happening to the large scale where the astrophysicist is looking at pieces of the universe. Okay, you see that? The universe could be in any number of probable states. He takes a measurement. He goes up, he grabs one out randomly of the possible states, and that's it now. He publishes that, and anybody else that looks there is going to see the same thing, just like that electron or that photon had to stay a particle and make one little spot of light like a particle. Once it's here, it's here. Okay. Now we could do the same thing. We could say, well, what if before he reports that, he has a heart attack and dies? If somebody else looks at the same place, will they get the same thing? Not necessarily. They would get the same array of probabilities if it happened right away. Probabilities change with time, but they may not draw out the same answer. And then that's the way the universe would be. Okay, so I think we've got that. So you see the why particles are probability distributions just as well as everything else. Everything starts in the future probability database, and until a measurement requires it to be rendered to a conscious being, making it appear as a physical particle in our virtual reality. Okay, once a particle, it must stay a particle for historical consistency. If you erase the data, erase the history, then you no longer have a consistency requirement for that data. It can be something else. Okay, now you see why that double slit experiment worked that way? Why, when we sorted those envelopes and the 50 where we burned the detector data came out to be diffraction patterns? Why? Because that was still in the future. So the state of that data was unknown. It was still in the future. When we burned the data, there was no inconsistency problem now with what came through, the which way data came through the slit. The data's gone. So at that point, you get a different answer. It's not that, well, it was one way, and then when we burned it, it made it change. It's not that it made it change, just like it's not that when you don't look, the tree disappears. It was never there in the first place. It was still just in the future. It wasn't until you looked that you made the measurement that collapsed the probability function. So it hadn't happened yet. It was indeterminate, you see. Because we think it's an objective reality, we think, well, that's already done. We took that data. That can't change. Well, we did take the data, and that was in the history, but we haven't seen what it looks like yet. And based on the amount of information that's here and what information is here, that future probability can change. Okay. Okay. What about rendering psi effects? Don't they violate the rule set? Generally, no, they don't violate the rule set. Remember, the rule set is not a objective causality. That's not the rule set. There is no objective causality. Okay, we have additional constraint there called the Sion uncertainty principle. It's part of the physical matter reality rule set. Okay, it's more like a company policy really than it is a rule set, but it works the same way. It represents the entanglement interaction of uncertainty with measurement of psi effects. So measuring psi effects and uncertainty are entangled. You can force your virtual physical reality to exceed the limits and functions of its defining physical rule set, but only if sufficient uncertainty remains in the system. There must always be, quote, plausible deniability by outsiders that the rule set was actually circumvented. It keeps psi in the earn it rather than the learn it category for the masses. Okay, it constrains psi effects to stay within natural uncertainty. Okay, and we're going to get to that a little later, this natural uncertainty and how the psi effects remain within that and why that's a good idea. Okay. This one is fun. The question is, does oxygen need to be rendered for the characters in World of Warcraft? And you say, well, of course not. Characters in World of Warcraft aren't real. They're just in a computer. They don't actually need oxygen. Yet one of these World of Warcraft characters falls in the river, doesn't know how to swim, it drowns. Why does it drown? Lack of oxygen. You don't have to render oxygen in the World of Warcraft, but you have to render the effects of oxygen, or oxygen deprivation. Our reality isn't any different either. Nobody here has to have oxygen rendered to them. We can't see oxygen. It's invisible to us unless we get out a microscope or some other kind of exotic technology that would allow us to see an oxygen molecule. Nothing like that's being rendered to us. It's not in our reality. The only thing that gets rendered here, of course, is the effects of the oxygen or the lack thereof. So why do we keep on breathing if no oxygen is being rendered in this room? Because it's probable. Because of the rule set and probability. It's a probable future. As long as there's enough green trees outside and there's enough plankton in the oceans, then the probability is that there's enough oxygen in this room. And because that's probable, we continue to sit here and interact and do just fine. We kill those trees and get rid of that plankton, and it's no longer probable that there'll be oxygen in this room. We all fall over dead because there's no oxygen in the room. You see, it's a probable reality. The rule set tells us what the probability is, and we reach up in that distribution and pull out an answer. Okay, well, we're all still breathing. We're all going along fine. We just assume there's oxygen here. None of it has to be rendered. This is a virtual reality. Don't confuse it with the objective reality that requires oxygen to be here all the time because we need it. We don't need it. We just need to express its effects. Okay. Now, if you look at the biology and you look at the role of oxygen and you're down at a molecular level, sure, it has to be there. Then it has to be rendered. But now, if in the game of The Sims, if there was a brain surgeon in The Sims, that brain surgeon would have to find a brain inside that Sim's skull, right? It'd have to be, once that Sim's skull was cut open by the Sims brain surgeon, there'd be a brain in there. Because that's where all the thinking's done for the Sims characters, right? So our virtual reality is just more detailed and sophisticated because it evolved rather than being programmed. Our sense of physical realness is an illusion. What is probable according to our rule set is enforced. Consistency is required. Okay, just as in The Sims, molecules do not need to be rendered unless somebody's looking at them. Okay. If a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? No, there is no tree. There's no woods. There's no listener. They're all virtual. They're all statistical and probabilistic. Okay, so here's the before state. There's a woods that is unknown. A person walks into that woods, sees a dead tree. That dead tree is still standing. It hasn't fallen over yet, but it's wobbly. Dead tree. Okay, he goes away. He comes back 5 years later, and he sees a dead tree lying on the floor of the woods, around the same place. Okay, now did the tree fall? No, there is no tree. Remember, there is no woods. It didn't fall. The probability was when he walked in the woods the first time, there was all kinds of configurations that could have been in that woods that was unknown, right? It could have been all sorts of things there. Well, he reaches up and he grabs out of the probability distribution what's likely to be there, and because of the rule set, you know, it was a deciduous forest, not a pine forest. It was this and that. There's all this rule set, all the way the set evolved from the big digital bang. There was a probability that they would find a dead tree standing there. So that's what came out. Just a detail in the woods that was rendered to this person when he walked into it. Now he walks into it 5 years later, and the probability is that given all the wind and storms and everything else and how wobbly that tree was, the probability is that 5 years later it wouldn't be standing. So when he walks in that time, what's he see? It gets rendered to him that there's a tree laying on the ground. It didn't have to fall over. It was rendered standing up. It was rendered laying down because that's what was probable. You see, we live in a statistical, probabilistic reality. We don't live in an objective reality. Objective causality is an approximation where there's little uncertainty. See, there's a lot of uncertainty when you walk into a woods that nobody's ever been in, that nobody knows what's in there. There's a lot of uncertainty. There could be a lot of different things there, configured a lot of different ways. So now let's take some variations on that. So let's say he goes into the woods and he walks out of the woods and then turns around and goes right back in again. Is he going to see the same thing? Yes, of course, because he's already made the measurement. It's in this reality. So let's say he takes a look at the woods, he goes out, and as soon as he steps out of the woods, he gets eaten by a bear. Now let's say that 5 minutes later, the full bear, the bear with the full stomach is gone, and another guy walks into the woods at the same spot. Is he going to see that same wobbly dead tree? Maybe, maybe not. We know that it's probable that it could be there, but when he reaches up and grabs in that distribution, he may come out with something else. It may not be a wobbly dead tree there. Okay? May or may not. It's likely because that was what was probable before, but probability changes with time, and in something like a woods, there's probably all kinds of configurations of what might be there that are all about equally probable. So he might have had something else altogether. Okay, let's say that he goes into the woods, he sees that dead tree there, he comes back a week later, but he doesn't really remember the dead tree. It didn't make a big impression on him. So it was there, he saw it, but it didn't really, if you asked him whether the dead tree was there or not, he really wouldn't have been able to tell you for sure. He said, I think I kind of remember something like that, but I'm not really sure. Well, he has to stay within the natural uncertainty. So there may or may not be a dead tree there. But there couldn't be like a stack of 20 dead trees there, because that he would have remembered, right? So that would not have been so uncertain. The fact that there was just one dead tree, like some other one, he didn't get it. So then it may or may not be a dead tree there, because it came into his awareness but left, because it didn't make a very big impression. That's like the double slit where the data gets erased. As the data gets erased, we're back to the future as far as future probability of what's there. All right. So what about squirrels and bugs? Okay. If they have a decision space, now, of course, squirrels have a decision space. They can make decisions. They're not completely hardwired. They can make decisions about things. So the bugs are kind of up for grabs whether they have a decision space or not. It maybe depends on the bug. Some bugs are smarter than other bugs. But let's say that if they have a decision space, the woods is rendered to them as appropriate. So if they're a squirrel and that squirrel lives in that dead tree, has a hole in that dead tree, then the squirrel is aware, and that dead tree is rendered to that squirrel's consciousness to an extent that a squirrel perceives things. Now, what a squirrel perceives is different than what we perceive. It's not the same picture, but it's a squirrel's picture of that dead tree. Okay? If they don't have a decision space, then they're more like the computer-generated characters. Right? They're not conscious. They don't have something rendered to them. They're just part of the scenery. Okay? We have those too. Now, if the squirrels were aware of the dead tree, the man would also see the dead tree, because that consciousness would have brought that dead tree into existence, and as the man walked in, he would have to see the same dead tree. See what I mean? And the reason for that is you can't have an inconsistency. You can't have squirrels living in a dead tree that isn't there. So it's a multiplayer game, and that game includes the squirrels and the dogs and the cats and all the critters that have a decision space. So we're all part of this game together. So it's not just us. We're getting our own data stream, but it's a multiplayer game. Our data stream has to connect with all the other data streams. They all have to be consistent. And it's the same in World of Warcraft and The Sims. All that has to be consistent. If a Sims person, does something, then it's other players in the game see them do that thing. Whatever it is, it has to be consistent. That's the way it is. So you see that uncertainty provides wiggle room within the constraints of Sion certainty and within the rules that call for rule set consistency. Okay, cultural beliefs about the nature of reality are very hard to let go of, so we're going to talk about those in the next slide. But I know you're having trouble with this because it sounds so crazy, and that's because you are a believer in objective reality because it's part of your culture to do that. It's very difficult not to do that. It's hard to not believe in objective reality, but it's just a belief. All right. So here's a cartoon. Who and what are we? A bigger picture of a cultural belief trap. So we're just going to look at our beliefs here. So there's us. That's a little happy face in the middle. And that other stuff, this is stuff and that's stuff. And here are other people besides us. And there's some stuff. Okay, now, the way we see ourselves is that everything is physical and external. There's us and then there's everything else. We are separate. Okay? Now, we try to conceptualize that we are part of the larger consciousness system. We try to conceptualize that we're one with all. Because the larger consciousness, we're just a piece of that. We're one. Well, here's what we see when we try to do that. That's a picture of us and the larger consciousness system, us and the one, and we're connected. But you see, when we're trying to be connected, we put ourselves up here on a little stick. And there's other on a little stick, and there's the one. You see, we can't really be a part of it. We have to separate ourselves on a little stick. So here we are, we're trying to be one, but mysteriously connected and separate at the same time. All right? Now, here's us trying to be one with our higher self. Here's the higher self, and there's us, and there's other incarnations. But notice they're all out on little sticks. They're all separate because we can't imagine ourselves not being separate. That's just our habit of thinking and believing that we're in this objective reality with its us and everything else. Okay? This is more of what it's like. Okay, here we are. Here's what we are. Here's the larger conscious system, and we're just a piece of that system. We're not really, I'm this little piece here with the two eyes on top. That's wrong. We're just a part of that system. It's all together, one system. We're not up on a little stick, separate somehow. And here's the way we think about it. Here's our body. Here's our free will awareness unit. That's our consciousness here. Here's our higher self or oversoul, an individuated unit of consciousness, and there's the larger consciousness system. We think it's all these hierarchies, one within the other, but these are all just metaphors. The body, the free will awareness unit, higher self, all those things, even the larger consciousness system itself is just a metaphor. It's a metaphor that we use to enable us to communicate with each other. You draw the separating lines in your conceptualization of reality because you cannot imagine a thing that is not distinct and spatially, functionally separate. In your mind, existence requires separateness. That's a belief, a cultural belief. It's a belief that goes along with being in a virtual reality. Okay, I'm going to tell you what you are at the most fundamental level. You as a unique, individuated unit of consciousness, which we call individuated unit of consciousness, the IUOC. You do have individuality in the form of individual history data. Continuity of growth, learning, lowering of entropy, from experience packet to experience packet is required for cumulative learning. Okay, let's say that again. I just confused you, didn't I? You're a unique, individuated unit of consciousness, okay, that you have individuality. And that individuality is in the form of history data. You have an individual, unique history. Continuity of growth, lowering your entropy from experience packet to experience packet, is required for cumulative learning. Cumulative learning is called evolution. Evolution has to take place over time. You are not a separate thing. You are an evolving collection of experience data, rules, patterns, memory, and perhaps some processing capability with a specific level of entropy that you're trying to decrease, experience packet by experience packet. You're a distributed cell of the larger consciousness system. Okay. For example, think of a computer file. If you have a Word file someplace, you give it a name and you save it and you file it away. Where is that Word file? If you think it's a bunch of little 1 and zeros up in the corner of your hard drive someplace, you're mistaken. that word file is spread all over that hard drive. You've got ones and zeros belonging to that file that are just strewn all over that hard drive. And when things get separated enough, it's when you have to go defrag the drive, right? And try to get things that belong together closer together so the drive doesn't have to go so far to find the next bit that it has to pull out. Well, that's the same way. Now, that's an artifact of the way computers are designed and made. But there's no reason to think that we aren't distributed all over the larger consciousness system. You don't have to think of us as a separate little bundle of ones and zeros and bits stuck up on a stick with the little happy face on it. Okay, just think of yourself as a part. We are all one. We are all part of the same larger consciousness system. Okay, the model that I'm talking about, the model of you that's in the future probable database and the past database, the model of you in that database doesn't have free will. Data sets don't need free will. They're one with the larger consciousness system, and the larger consciousness system has free will, just like your nose doesn't have free will. It's one with your body. You have the free will. Okay? It's good that your nose doesn't have free will and it countermands your decisions, does things you don't want it to do. To evolve that data set further, the larger consciousness system must start with the capability of your IUOC, your individuated unit of consciousness, your history, your evolution data set, and then constrain that data to a set of experience to experience only what a specific virtual reality rule set allows. That is, you're placed in a specific as a specific individual with free will in a virtual reality where you have the opportunity to evolve by making choices. So putting you in a virtual reality is what allows the system to give you free will to make choices within that virtual reality. Otherwise, in the databases, you're just history, rules. Okay? In the database. The free will and consciousness comes to you as a result of this decision space generated within the experiential virtual reality. If your individuated unit of consciousness is simultaneously in a different virtual reality, it may also have free will. So that's where you have this idea of the higher self. If the higher self is also in a virtual reality at the same time, it also has free will and decision space, and you may interact with it. If not, if it's just back in the larger consciousness system, hanging out, then it does not have free will. It's just there. Starting to get the picture. I know this is hard to do. I'm saying it slowly. It's hard to get. But if you need a guide, we talk about guides, one bubbles up out of the system. Okay? What is a guide? It's your interface with the larger reality. Your intuition is another interface you have with the larger reality. And this is your interface if you are in a virtual reality, where you've been put in a virtual reality. Now you have free will, have choices to make, you're growing up, you're in a learning lab. If you need to interact with the larger consciousness system, a guide bubbles up to interact with you. An angel, whatever it is you want to communicate with, one of the dead people you know. Okay, a guide simply represents a metaphor in your mind. Anything that communicates with us, we call a being. That's our definition of a being. Rocks don't talk to us. So when we are out of body, or when we're in our mind and in our imagination even, and we're interacting with something that's communicating with us, it's a give and take communication, it's a being. Because that's our metaphor for something that interacts with us. Okay, it's a being. So that's why we represent these in our mind as beings. The guide is one form of information interface to the larger consciousness system. Okay, you interpret guide as a separate being, like you, but with a larger perspective. That attitude is a physical matter reality, conceptual separateness, talking about reality from the perspective of your beliefs. All right, a guide as a separate being doesn't really make sense, does it? That's how we perceive it. That's how we interact with it. but it really doesn't make sense. Can you imagine this being, this very wise being who knows a whole lot more than you do, and his whole job is to just follow you around and think every thought you think, every idea, every word you speak, every emotion you have, and it's just, talk about a reality show. Just hangs out with you, just observes every twinge, every thought, every idea you have, and that's his job, that's your guide. He just hangs there with you. That would be a real boring job, wouldn't it? It's basically not like that. That's just the way we see it. And there's no reason to say that these guides don't have personalities, don't have senses of humor. Of course they do. It's your interface with the larger consciousness system, and that interface can be consistent. It doesn't have to be a random interface. So sure, it can be your friend. I have non-physical entities that I've interacted with for 40 years. Some of my best friends don't have bodies, but they're consistent. Okay? Sure, they're consistent. It's a consistent interface. So when you need that interface, when you need that guidance, when you need that interaction with the larger consciousness system because you need information, you need somebody to talk to, you need comfort, whatever it is you need, whatever you're getting from this being, well then it's you and the larger consciousness system, and that guides your interface. All right? So see, we're all one. We've got to get ourselves off those little happy faces, off the sticks, and we're back into the system. It's just an individuated unit of consciousness at one. We're all one in this system. It's one large thing. Okay. Instead of imposing our beliefs and physical reality structure on the larger consciousness system, let those physical reality-generated beliefs and assumptions go, and let your guides form up out of the larger system on demand, just as you form up out of the larger system on demand to participate in this physical virtual reality. See, I'm giving you a bigger picture now, that probably stomping on some of your favorite ideas, but this is the bigger picture. All right. Consciousness, experiencing virtual reality generated by consciousness. So you see there's a lot of feedback here. The system's designed to facilitate its own evolution by providing a physical reality where experience and feedback facilitates your evolution. That's what we've just been saying. Okay. Now, conscious intent changes the probabilities. Now, this is another big thing to understand. Your conscious intent modifies those probabilities that are in the future. So here's all the possible things that could happen in the future, and here's the probability that they will happen. Your intent can modify those probabilities. That's part of our feedback in this learning lab. Okay. That's how we heal. We use our intent to modify the probability of that disease getting better or worse. Okay. That's how we have green thumbs, right? The people who really are good with plants. It's because they relate to those plants. It's because they talk to those plants. They have emotional connection to those plants. They love those plants, and that positive energy modifies the probability of how that plant's going to grow. And the people who have brown thumbs really don't care much for the plant. The plant's a pain in the neck. You have to keep watering the damn thing or it'll die. And it takes time, it takes energy, and you just don't relate to it. The plants don't do well, even if you do remember to water them on time, because you're not giving them that love. You're not connected to them. You're not changing that probability for a positive outcome, you see. We do all sorts of things like that. Dennis Menerick, a friend of mine that started with me at Bob Monroe's place, he says that he works in an area that's very congested, and he can't find parking places very easily because there's way more people than there are parking spaces that have to inhabit that small piece of territory. So he starts out in the morning with an intent that there will be a parking space there when he arrives. Okay, now it has to be just occurring when he arrives, because if it occurred 10 seconds before he arrives, somebody else would pull into it. So he has to have in his mind that just as he gets there, a parking space will open up. And he says that about 80% of the time, that works. He can create that parking space. I know people who call cabs that way. You know, if you have the intent, you can modify the probable future. Okay, you can, all sorts of things. We know that. I have up here listed a whole bunch of them, you know, like talking to your car. The people who love their car, you know, and they have a personal relationship with that car. Well, that car will do a whole lot better for them than the person that's kicking the tires and swearing at the car because it's always breaking down. Well, that's part of the reason why it's always breaking down. You're changing the probable future to be a negative one, or you can change it to be a positive one. You see? So we do this all the time. We know that back in 1956 or 57, middle 50s, Norman Vincent Peale wrote a book called The Power of Positive Thinking. It got real popular for a while, sold a whole lot of books, and then the scientific community basically made the statement that the guy was a fraud because none of that stuff could possibly happen. What you think about it doesn't make any difference because this is an objective reality, and poor Norman kind of went off in disgrace. But ever since then, the ideas still stick, and everybody knows it's true. People who are positive and have real positive attitudes generally have real positive things in their life, and people who have negative attitudes generally have tough lives. Negative things happen to them a lot. You've probably all heard of the law of attraction, right? That was a big deal, went all over the internet and movies and things some years back. It's the same thing. Now they say the universe will give you what you program, but it's nothing to do with the universe. It has to do with the larger consciousness system. You can modify the probabilities based on your intent. Okay? But now, think about this. The larger consciousness system is there. You are here for the sole purpose of evolving the quality of your consciousness. Okay? So if you're here to reduce your fear and become love, reduce your ego, if you start using your intent to satisfy your ego, you're asking the system to work against itself. You're asking the system basically to modify those probabilities so that it can can puff up your ego. You know, what I really want is a new Mercedes-Benz, because that'll really impress everybody. What I want is a real pretty girlfriend or a rich husband or whatever. If it's all ego-driven, you're asking the system to work against itself. And what'll happen is, one, it just may not work at all, or if it does work for you, you will get smacked along with what it is that you want. In other words, you'll get it, and it's like be careful what you wish for. You might get it. It's called unintended consequences. You get it, but it hurts when you get it. It isn't what you thought it would be. It makes you even more miserable than you were before, etc. So that's, yes, the law of attraction does work. Has nothing to do with the universe. It's just the way consciousness is constructed. But if you want it to get it to puff up your ego, you're asking for a lesson that may not feel good. So that's okay. So why doesn't it always work consistently? Why can't you just put your intent out there and it always works just the way you want it to? And that's in general for psi. Why doesn't psi always work consistently? That's one of the things that's why the scientists don't like psi, because it's inconsistent. Because in an objective reality, you look at the way it's supposed to work, it's very consistent, right? It's very consistent. Scientific method says that anything that's true can be done anywhere by anybody, anytime, and it'll always be the same. Well, it's not an objective reality. Psi is about consciousness, and the fact that it's not objective doesn't violate any laws. Objectivity is just a hallucination, just an approximation. So, why doesn't it happen consistently? Well, let me jump forward one. You've seen this chart before, but now you're seeing it. I'm going to talk to it just a little differently. One of the reasons it doesn't happen consistently is here we see probabilities just changed with time, right? This used to be the probability, but now time's gone by and that probability's changed. So somebody else does the same experiment later, won't necessarily get the same result because the probability distribution's different. You walk back into that woods, you might not see that dead tree. Probability distribution. And another thing is, it's the way you randomly select out of that distribution. Remember we talked about tunneling? Sometimes you just happen to select something that's really not very likely. Doesn't happen often, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you get something that's a little unlikely. Okay, so those are two of the reasons why. Let's see. Another reason why it doesn't always work is there are multiple intents. You don't have the only intent that's impinging on the problem. The result may have a dozen or 100 or 1,000,000 people who have intents about the way that probable future is going to unravel. Okay? So you're not the only one who's putting their intent there. Other people are as well, and all of that has to work itself out. So that's why it doesn't always work. Everything changes. The number, intensity, focus of individual intents change. Learning opportunities, that's the intent of the system, to deliver you learning opportunities. That might change. Natural uncertainty levels, how Sion uncertainty principles applied might change. Random selection out of the databases might change. So all of those things is why it's not consistent. Okay. Conscious intent is the motive force within the consciousness system. You're both the creator and the experiencer. Okay. I think the other these things are obvious. Why do we live? We talked about that. Why do we live in such a muddled mess? Because that's what we are. That's what our intent creates. We create our own reality. We create our future. You see, now we can say that, and we can say it a little more way. We create it directly with our intent changing the probable future. We create it indirectly, well, I guess it's still directly, with our interpretation. Remember those two consciousnesses? We create our reality because we interpret things according to our own metaphors that are a function of our own unique personal experience. So there's lots of ways we create our own reality. Here's an example in medicine. Let's say the larger consciousness system, according to the rule set, calculates a lump, that a lump forming on your neck is very probable. Okay? Why? I don't know. You know, maybe you breathed asbestos once in your childhood, or maybe it was just some genetic thing that was improbable that came up. So let's say that lump forms. We don't know why at this point, but the rule set, the science, the biology ends up with a rule there. Okay, there's a whole lot of uncertainty about what that lump is. We don't know at this point. At this point, it has so much uncertainty about it that if we used our intent to modify our uncertainty about what it was, to change the probable future so that that lump would turn out to be benign, it would be relatively simple to do that because there's a lot of uncertainty around it. Where there's a lot of uncertainty, it's easier for you to modify future probability. Okay, but now let's say that you go to the doctor and the doctor does a biopsy, and that means he makes a measurement. He brings something into this reality by bringing data and information here. And let's say that then you go to other doctors. So you got one, and let's say you go to 4 doctors and they do biopsies, 4 more. And now you have even less uncertainty. So let's say that all of these doctors, or let's say that you had 5 doctors and 4 of them out of 5 said that you had some kind of malignant tumor that would kill you in 2 months. Always deadly. Everybody with this tumor always dies in a couple of months. Okay, now what's the uncertainty?